Sir Richard Carter was a baron of the primary resources of our country, creating our biggest forestry and fishing companies. Just as his business was linked with natural cycles of growth, he was a man who took the long view, far-sighted, a man who achieved his goals no matter what the obstacles. This interview was the last he gave before passing away in 2011. Looking back on your great career, what gives you the greatest sense of satisfaction?
Oh, I think that instinctively would be the success in growing the company as we did. That was made up of a number of individual successes, of course, both in the timber and sawmilling areas as well as in the fishing. Because we took Sealord from nothing to an international company. The investment with the Japanese in Pan Pac was the first of its type anywhere in the world, as basically was the investment into Chile as well. And they all had their attendant risks, of course, but we made our judgments and went with them.
It was a business you built on some big calls. What's your view on risk?
Well, everybody's perception of risk is different, of course, and I guess a lot of it is related to the amount of intestinal fortitude that one might have in deciding what risk you can wear and what you can't. And most of it, of course, is intangible.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, Chile would be a good example. There it was more a judgment as to whether the political risk would work out in our favour or not. As it turned out, it did. And that meant that the judgment of whether it would or wouldn't in that instance was correct. But it was still, at the time it was made, it was by no means certain that what we believed would work out would in fact do so. There was a general perception that we shouldn't be involved in an area where there'd been a military takeover, and some people disenfranchised. We took a different view. We took the view that in fact the communists had taken over where they weren't wanted. And there was a very good chance after Pinochet took over and threw them out that would revert to a healthy sort of democratic situation, which in fact is what happened. But again, at the time we were making those judgments, that's all it was. It was purely a judgment on what we believed were the surrounding circumstances. And we judged them to be positive in terms of the political change we could see.
It was very much a business decision, and you divorced away some of those more moral issues?
That'd be right.
Did you meet Pinochet?
Yeah, just like anybody else.
What was the magnitude of that deal in terms of dollars, and what did it mean to the company?
The initial investment was about 130 million US. That was into a joint venture with a Chilean entrepreneur called Angelini. The joint venture then invested into a company called Copec, which was the largest company in Chile, and it owned a whole range of forests, pulp mills, petrol distribution, electricity companies, and a large number of retail shopping centres.
If that deal had gone sour, and there was risk of that, what would the impact have been on Carter Holt?
Oh, it would have been severe, but I think we would have survived it.
That was an example of leadership. Talk to me about leadership. What is the essential characteristics that you need to lead a public company?
It's hard to describe in black and white. I think it's more instinctive than taught. It's really an ability to see the bigger picture and not take no for an answer in trying to reach your goal. It's never easy, in the sense that you have to be prepared for setbacks and difficulties that circumstances and people will put in front of you, and circumventing them can become part of the major issue in leading your way through to a final success.
So, if you think of yourself, what is your number one attribute?
Never taking no for an answer, probably. Certainly having a very long-term view of where I wanted to be was in behind it all.
Now, I want to explore that, because never saying no can be interpreted as being bloody-minded or stubborn, but what you're talking about is the longer view, the end goal, delivered by at times being decisive or by taking another route.
Yes, it's a mixture of both. Very often there were political difficulties associated with what we wanted to do, and those are situations where it's always necessary to circumvent rather than try and go straight through. But again, it was hanging on to the longer term view that keeps you going in that direction. It's often much easier to give it all up and walk away, but being able to stick to your guns, I think, is most of the battle.
So this leads me on to mistakes. What would be your biggest?
I think probably my biggest mistake was trusting some people too much and taking them for granted. And then finding that when circumstances changed, so did they. And these became evident only after very long-term relationships, which was the most difficult part about them.
That sounds a difficult mistake to avoid.
It is, and it could sour you from trying again, or trusting people to the same degree again.
How did you deal with that?
I just formed new relationships. They were basically financial relationships with banks, both overseas banks and local.
So is it good to fail at times?
Well, it makes you more cautious in the types of deals you might subsequently write. It led me to be more careful about shaking a hand on a demand type obligation, as opposed to later on, I guess, trying to bed them down in a much more black and white sense through agreements. And it's the unexpected that causes the problems. Because you suddenly find that certain people that had all the authority in the world suddenly haven't.
If you were looking for a young, up-and-coming person, what would you look for?
Well, basically honesty and integrity, and that about covers everything else.
So if there was one thing you learnt from doing the job that you would pass on to someone starting out, what would it be?
I think it brings me back to an original comment of fortitude. Stick in there and don't give up. Textbooks are fine, I guess, for some information and guidance as to what you might need to do in certain circumstances, but there's no textbook at all that can tell you, in fact, what to do and how to do it. This is where one can get a little cynical about MBAs and Harvard School of Businesses and all the rest of it. They're dealing with theoretical situations in their training. It's not the upfront shot in the eye that the students are really dealing with. And well, I guess the ability to roll with the punches counts as much as anything.
When you look back on your career, what is a telling example of your need to show resilience?
Time and time again. But a good example, I suppose, would be Sealord. Sealord was nothing when we became involved, and to make it something, we had to get government approvals to operate offshore fishing vessels, in this case Japanese, and that involved basically years of argument and hassle and repeated interviews with ministers and members of parliament and the whole 9 yards of beating against doors until we got our approvals. But again, it was a case of sticking with it, not giving up. And ultimately, of course, Sealord developed into a very successful international company.
But you didn't give up and devote your resources elsewhere. you kept focusing on the long-term gain.
It was the long-term nature of a resource that was basically renewable in the case of the fishing, so long as the levels of catch were monitored to the ability of the resource to regenerate. It was there forever. And of course the same philosophy applied to trees. The whole mindset is around the growth cycle of a radiata pine tree, which you harvest at about 28 years of age. So you're reacting to those types of influences rather than any short-term knee-jerk reactions to anything.
So long as you have the fundamentals right, no reason to panic.
Oh, well, a case of tighten your belt and hang on, really. Do whatever you can to survive. And have faith in that it's going to get better in the future. If you didn't have that, of course, you wouldn't do anything. You just curl up, shut the doors and pack it in. But you have to have some faith that things are going to get better, as I think inevitably they will.
We've experienced a rather bearish economy recently. What's your advice? A time for risk, a time for caution?
No, if you panic is when you're gone. No, you just got to try and hang in there. Because there's certain things you can do nothing about. Currency is one. And very often it's the currency that makes the difference between winning and losing. And of course there are things you can do. You can go offshore and do what it is you want to do. Or hang in there and hope one day that the currency will change. People can write all sorts of books and produce fancy ideas. And IT changes can introduce new things, but the fundamentals are still the same. You've got to make a judgment as to whether you're going to spend your money or not. And if you're not good at that, then you're going to be a failure.